You have warned about stagflation, and some of the numbers we're seeing in slowdown might point in the direction of the stag part. What about the inflation part? Is it possible that the slowing down will actually avoid some of the inflation you're concerned about?
Well, inflation in the United States is still 8.5%. It might have peaked, but the question is how fast it's going to fall. With the Fed still having real rates on the policy side highly negative, I don't think the monetary policy is tight enough to push inflation towards 2% fast enough. So I'm still of the view that in the past, in the US, whenever you had inflation above 5% and unemployment below 5%, the Fed tightening has led to a hard landing. So my baseline is a hard landing.
So we got those CPI and PPI numbers out last week that the markets found encouraging. What did you take from them? Does that indicate we have peaked?
Yes, we may have peaked, even if there could be further spikes in inflation driven by China continuing with zero COVID policy. The war between Russia and Ukraine could get worse, and therefore you could have further spikes to commodity prices, whether energy, food, fertilizer, industrial metals. So there are plenty of upsides. And what goods inflation may be going down, service inflation, especially shelter and others, is still quite persistent. And wages are growing much higher than productivity. Therefore, there is a wage price spiral, even if wages are growing less than prices. So we are still in a severely inflationary environment, not just in the United States, but around the world.
Dr. Roubini, you mentioned the negative real rate. In your opinion, what does the Federal Reserve have to do? How much hiking do they need to do to really put a stop to inflation?
Well, they're already saying that that by the end of the year, they should be at 3.4. And then by 3.8 at the end of next year. So markets expecting a pivot and the Fed cutting rates next year, to me, sounds delusional. But even if you were at 3.8 with inflation still well above target, around 8%, falling only gradually, core inflation around 6-ish, you're still in negative territory. So the Fed funds rate should be going well above 4%, 4.5% to 5% in my view, to really push inflation towards 2%. If that doesn't happen, inflation expectations are going to get unhinged. Or if that happens, then we're going to have a hard landing. So either way, either you get a hard landing or you get inflation getting out of control.
To avoid that unhinging, as you put it, of inflation expectations, does the Fed need to get to 2, or what if it got to 3?
Well, they're going to get initially towards 3 and then to 2. But the point is that with headline being around 8.5 and with core being around 6-ish, even getting to 3 is going to be quite a challenge. And therefore, even getting to 3 implies effectively, in my view, a hard landing of the real economy. And the data suggests that we're headed towards that hard landing. You know, the Empire State measure today was terrible. The data out of China are terrible. The data out of Europe are terrible. The employment report was positive, but all the forward-looking indicators of the labor market, initial claims, job openings, quits, the ISM component that is employment, announcement of layoffs, and so on and so on. All those are suggesting that there's a very sharp deceleration even of the labor market. Payroll numbers are a backward-looking indicator, not a forward-looking indicator. So we are in a sharp slowdown. We had 2 negative quarters of growth in the first half. We're going towards a recession.
So you've talked about a recession before, and even on Bloomberg, you said that it's delusional, to use that word again, to think that it's going to be relatively short and relatively shallow. Is that still your view?
Yes, it is my view, because we live in a world in which there is massive amounts of private and public debt. So if you go into a recession, zombie corporation, zombie financial institution, zombie household, zombie countries, zombie governments are going to go bust. Everybody's tightening at the same time. In the last 2 crises, GFC and COVID, we eased massively monetary and fiscal policy because it was a demand shock and we had deflationary pressure. This time around, we're going to be having to tighten monetary policy into a recession because inflation is above target. We don't have fiscal bullets, and with negative supply shocks, fiscal stimulus is the wrong policy response. So if you combine all these things together, not only we get stagflation with negative supply shock, we get a stagflationary debt crisis. So the recession is going to be long, protracted, severe, and associated with financial distress across the board.
We never like to say it's different this time, but is it slightly different this time in the sense that there is a lot of money still on the balance sheets of households and corporations? There's a lot of dry powder out there left over from a lot of that fiscal stimulus.
Well, both the corporate sector and the household sector are split. If you're in the top part of the distribution of the household sector, you have income, you have wealth, you have jobs. But, in the bottom side, things are very stressed out, both in terms of P&L and the balance sheet. Same thing in the corporate sector. There were tons of firms that have highly leveraged, didn't have much profits, they were zombie, they would have gone bust. But during COVID, we bailed out everybody. Zero rate, negative rates, quantitative easing, credit easing, backstopping, money market, commercial paper, high yield, high grade, you name it. Now that we have to tighten as inflation is higher, the zombies are going to collapse. And both in the household sector, in the corporate sector, in the shadow financial system, some sovereigns and some countries, you have many, many parts of the global economy that are essentially zombie, and they're going to go bust. So the average essentially hides the fact that in terms of distribution, you have really stronger balance sheets and worse balance sheets, and the worst balance sheets are now dominant.
So to try to look for a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, is there possibly some encouragement from the elimination of some of the so-called zombie companies? In this sense, zombie companies typically occupy a fair amount of capital that's not as productive as it could be. Could the redeployment of capital actually increase productivity and help us, maybe not in the short term, but in the medium and longer term?
Yes, in the medium long term, you have to get rid of the zombies because you need creative distraction. But that process is associated with a recession, with financial crisis, with massive defaults across the board. We saw some of that happening during the global financial crisis. The problem is that every time you try to do creative distraction, central banks come with an excuse to try to backstop household, corporates, financial system, governments, and so on. And that creates a cycle of a debt trap, where you're using unconventional monetary, fiscal, and credit policy to backstop the system. You prevent essentially that creative distraction occurring, and you have increasing zombification of the economy. Private and public debt ratio globally used to be in 2000, 200% of GDP. Today, they're 350% and rising. In advanced economies, are 420% and rising. In China, 330% of GDP and rising. In the US, private and public debt as a share of GDP is higher than during the Great Depression and after World War II. And we're not coming out of a major war or a Great Depression. So these debt levels are unsustainable across the world. And that's official debt. If you include implicit liability coming from aging, unfunded Social Security, healthcare, and so on, the number is even more staggering in terms of debt ratio and unsustainable debt conditions.